What's good everybody? Ivy here. Today I'm about to present you modern Metal Drumkit project. Check this shit. This one is my attempt to create solid foundation for future works. I mixed it to a state that's in my opinion will be optimal starting point for all kinds of different drum mixes. In other words, tight and aggressive sounding, yet without specific coloring. Once you print the multi-track from this project, it's only matter of subtle post-processing moves that will give you nice and polished sound. By the way, I'm also going to demonstrate one particular example of manipulation with stems. It will give you the sounding of upcoming Axedra album. You can find more info about this band in the pinned comment. And of course, same as always, this project will be available for my Patreon supporters. That be chilling in the link down below. Already having file pack for this video, which includes projects in Cubase and Reaper, all them presets together with my other projects and also lifetime supply of swag, all of that for just $1 per month. Since I'm not going to spend much time on every single thing in this review, there you will also find link to unlisted video with complete run-on project settings. And before we start, I'd wanted to point out one more thing. For some stupid reason I use the word shells in a sense of drum group related to cymbals. I only realized that I've made this mistake right before start of the video editing and it will take too much to go for everything once again just to fix one word. So please, don't be confused with that. Every time you see the word shells, I'm talking about the actual cymbals group. This naming change will be also included in all provided projects and presets. Starting from basic explanation of samplers and routing. Our main instrument is Contact with Invasion library on board. Contact works in multi-out mode, so every single element can be processed independently, nothing special there. Except for the fact that I use additional instances of Invasion in order to completely separate ride and hi-hat from the main kit, routing them to dedicated outputs and keeping original bleed from room and overheads. What this allows us to do, is to apply pretty extreme tone shifting for hi-hat or ride without any impact on other cymbals, and this is something that I've been waiting for years. Anyways, from this track we have MIDI sends to other 4-rack instruments, as you already guessed that will be triggers for kick and snare. First one is SSD5 with Snare 12 ANRG on board. This layer will give us some nice room, together with tight attack of dry part. All because we are taking advantage of SSD5 envelope processing. I'm heavily limiting length of direct signal, leaving only attack to stack up with the main snare. Next up, kick 10. Pretty much the same, we use this layer to bring some tightness and density to the kick. Phenomena snare. Extremely fat and compressed snare by Joshua Wickman. I was able to take it under control with processing so it will add up to density and sample variety of total snare tone, especially when it comes to lower velocity levels. And finally DRW22 MPL kick. This one is the opposite of other one we have. We only use it to add some nice body to the kick. Now let's have a quick look on project routing. As you can see, dry channels and room channels are grouped under related buses. That applies for kick, snare and toms. Despite its name, overhead bleed for kick and snare actually going to be big part of our dry tone, that's why it's not in the room category. That will be especially noticeable on toms, because there will be no processing deviations between bleed and dry tracks at all. Toms dry and room buses are routed to toms bus. In this case we're actually going to use it, while kick and snare buses do not hold any processing or gain staging and have no practical use. Now when it comes to cymbals, this project is going to be the first one where I will not get phase problems between overhead and room mix. And I guess you might see why. We don't have any processing on individual channels, so we can safely process every bus without fear of ruining other elements. All three of them subgroups are routed to Cymbals bus. Now let's go for processing, starting from kick dry sum. As you can see, most of the tracks remain unprocessed, in exception of kick 10 and overhead bleed tracks, where I cut out some problematic mids. All channels then go to kick dry bus. Here I'm using the EQ to make it sound brighter. Then clean out boxy mids around 400 Hz with Soothe. H-comp helps to get better transients and overall dynamics. Finally, low-end focus. This one is used to shorten sustain on lows, making it a little more tight. I keep it turned off during MIDI editing, because it introduces noticeable playback delay, so I'll only turn it on for a sake of effect demonstration, while you should do it only before the export. When it comes to room bleed, I only use processing on related bus so that phase shift between channels can be avoided. The main point here is to make our room transparent. I'm using CLA76 to keep it at more or less constant level. And then shift the tone with 2 EQs in such a way that nothing stands out too much. First equalizer works in phase linear mode, so that room part will not change when summed with dry kick. Second EQ is a little addition, this time in zero latency mode, because this tone correction was done with both dry and room tracks active. Now we're moving on to snare. Let's start from Phenomena track. The algorithm for this one goes like this. I cut off all the side information with Pro Q. Get rid of most of the ringing from mids by using Soothe 2. Then Saturn 2's Transient Shaper to get control over the sustain. Doing this in multi-band mode allows for better processing transparency. And finally I cut off some boxy mids. Now let's check this out. Such extreme processing will help this layer to sit well with other elements of our snare. Speaking of other elements though, I didn't process them that much. It all goes down to filtering certain mid-range zones. And in case of overhead bleed I also squashed the body with CLA76 to get better sound flow. Now all the tracks go to Snare Dry Bus, where I polish and tire some one more time, and also use some parallel compression with H-comp to glue layers together. Now room channels. Here I shift the tone of snare 12A, to get slightly more powerful sounding. I also use compression on room 4 mic to soften the attack. Room some then will be heavily polished with Soothe and Pro Q, as a result we'll get pretty transparent sound. Now let's go for toms. All the tracks including overhead bleed are only processed with SPL Transient Designer, slightly limiting sustain so there's less of a low-end ring. Channels then meet each other on Tom's dry bus, where I tame mid-range resonances with soothe, and then use Saturn to shorten low-end sustain once again. Tom's room channels remain unprocessed in order to keep original phase correlation. And when it comes to bus processing, I use Soothe for pretty much the same purposes. Only this time it's followed by Decapitator to get little more density and some really nice saturation. Now both buses are routed to Tom's bus, where I use Pro Q to form tight and powerful tone. That followed by each comp, which helps to glue everything together and get control over dynamics. Now it's finally time for our cymbals. Point of processing on all three buses here is pretty much the same. Cut out certain zones or resonances that stand out too much. Let's check it out. Finally, all three buses face each other on Cymbals bus. It's important to say that processing used on this bus won't be represented in multi-track you are going to get from this project. That's because we will use Cymbals hat and ride sub-buses for export, otherwise we could lose the ability to manipulate with sound or levels of hat and ride. So this processing model is more of a recommendation from me. Once stems are printed and put in your mix, you should route Cymbals, hat and ride to a new bus, call it Cymbals bus and apply same settings that we have here. Anyways, back to the processing. We're starting from boost of highs, making our cymbals just a little more bright. Then use SSL compressor to really open up our cymbals and give them solid sustain. Soothe with extreme settings helps to make them highs soft and transparent. And finally, polishing multiband compression. About 1 decibel of total reduction, very subtle thing, so you might choose to not use it at all. And so guys, we're done with processing. Now there are some general tips and rules of programming that I use for this kit. Since it's all written down, there is no point to spend time talking about it. The one thing I'd wanted to emphasize is the multi-pass export algorithm. There will be total of 4 exports, each one will be done from associated channels with export markers. First one is for kick. Second goes for snare. Third for toms. And finally fourth export is for cymbals. Before each pass, you should mute all the MIDI notes except for target element, and then perform batch export from channels marked with E as a target and move to a next step. So it will go like this: mute everything except for kick, search for channels that have E1 in their names and do batch export from them, go back to MIDI, mute the kick and unmute the snare, then do batch export from channels marked with E2 and so on. It's very important that you use 32-bit floating point wave format so that clipping can be avoided when transferring the audio between projects. So also make sure that you won't convert it back to 24-bit when importing, as it will clip your audio, ruining the whole point of 32-bit float. Now, as promised, I'm gonna show you one particular example of how this multi-track can be handled. You already know how it sounds like from the intro, so let's go straight to processing. First element is the kick. I use similar kind of EQ on kick dry and kick room to boost them lows and clean up other parts of spectrum. Both tracks go to kick bus, where I use Soothe in order to make our kick smoother and more transparent. Next up, the snare. Snare dry is processed with our bass exciter so it can be more powerful in the mix. Pre and post EQ is just gain staging that creates additional 4 decibels headroom for our bass so it won't clip. both snare tracks go to dedicated bus, where I cut a lot of mids with Soothe and Pro Q. Aside from that, I also cut highs just a little so the click won't be too aggressive. Tom's track doesn't have any processing, because it already sounds good enough. Now we have our cymbals united under cymbals bus, which follows original suggested processing in only exception of fourth element. I replaced multi-bin compressor with EQ to clean out all the whistling stuff on highs. Aside from that, I also clean up higher mids on hi-hat, and mid-range resonances on ride. Now cymbals, toms and snare have sense to drums reverb track. We are gonna use ProR to generate reverberation. On top of that, I'm using pretty extreme tone corrections to keep this reverb more or less transparent in the mix, despite of its great amount. Also, for some reason, I chose to widen the stereo just a bit. Finally, all the elements face each other on master bus. First three plugins follow the processing model from MMG number 29. The only exception is multi-bin compressor settings. Now all three working bands are in parallel mode. Also, there is no automatic gain compensation anymore, so I just use constant compensation on output. Next one is Soothe. It will automatically detect stuff that stands out too much across the entire spectrum, giving priority to 60 Hz region to avoid stacking lows on fast kick parts. Subtle stereo widening. Some more reverb, this time to glue all the elements of our mix together. subtle boost of mid so it won't sound too hollow. And finally Pro L in modern mode. Important to say that I used all round on the album, but outside of that context there might be cases where modern algorithm will work just fine. And so that's pretty much it. Feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon in the next one.